I'm with Practical Farmers of Iowa, and behind the scenes, pushing the buttons, is Emma Little. Today we're with Dylan Bruce of Circadian Organics near Viroqua, Wisconsin, and we'll have the next hour to see and discuss how he's experimenting with and implementing reduced-till practices for vegetables on his farm. And he's got a little bit of presentation and some results from trials he's done and a few slides, and then we'll take a walk around his farm. So before we get started, just want to share a little bit about some housekeeping things in our organization. Practical Farmers of Iowa is a farmer-led nonprofit based out of Ames. We specialize in farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing and farmer-led research with the mission to equip farmers to build resilient farms and communities. And all are welcome at our events, and we invite you to learn more at our website, practicalfarmers.org. Today's event is part of a 4-part series of From the Field webinars. Today and last week we've been in Wisconsin. Last week we were with the University of Wisconsin Extension, and I can see at least one of them on the webinar today. So thanks to our partners there. Today we're still in Wisconsin, and then next week we will move westward and visit a couple Iowa farms that are using some different types of no-till. So we hope you can join us for all 4 of these weekly events, but you can also revisit the recordings anytime on the PFI website and the PFI YouTube page. In addition to this web series, we have a host of other in-person and virtual events going on throughout the summer. Topics range from landowner-tenant relationships to cover crop seed cleaning to pasture watering systems to high-density apple trellis. And all of our summer events are free and open to everyone. You can find the complete list on our website, and hope to see you in person, but definitely still on these virtual events because I know it's easier for a lot of people who are busy with vegetables in the summer. Thanks for being here. Just some tips about the webinar tonight. Looks like a lot of you are figuring out the chat box. That's great. I know Dylan just has his phone out there, so if you want to type questions to Dylan in the chat box and make the "to" say "to everyone" or "to all panelists and attendees," we'll be able to see your questions and I'll pass them through to Dylan. We'll run until 7 o'clock Central, and again, we want this to be interactive, so definitely put your questions in, and I'll be keeping an eye on that chat box, and we'll relay them to Dylan throughout. Last thing, of course, we all come from diverse experiences and viewpoints, so please keep your questions and comments respectful in the chat. And with that, Dylan, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, turn it over to you.
Great, yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you all today. I don't know, maybe some folks that I know out there. It's definitely, for reduced tillage, learning from other farmers has been just as important for me as learning from the research that I've participated in and gotten to read and learn from and see presented. So happy to be hopefully returning the favor so you can learn from some of my mistakes and maybe some of the things I figured out along the way. I also wanted to mention that in addition to Circadian Organics, which is my farming business here on my family's farm that I run with my partner, my fiance, Sky Harnsberger, I'm also involved with UW-Madison, and I've been working with Dr. Aaron Silva there for about 5 years, as well as Dr. Julie Dawson and Rue Ginger and the past couple years. And Rue and Claire both this year, who you saw present last week, hopefully. And if you didn't see it present, you can find the recording. But yeah, I've got a little presentation that maybe we can share now to kind of run through some background and stuff, and then we can switch over to the kind of farm tour and demo here. Before I continue, is the sound quality coming through all right?
You sound great, and Emma's got your first slide up.
Excellent. All right, let's roll. Yeah, so I'm going to run through real quick kind of some of the research that I was involved in that sort of set the stage for, when I started Circadian Organics in 2018, some of the practices that we implemented, and a little background on our farm, what we do, kind of the main reduced tillage approaches that we take, and some kind of example rotations, how we implement that. And please feel free to, as questions roll in, please interrupt me and we can kind of address stuff as it's topical. And then we'll finish off with kind of walk around the farm, and hopefully the video quality holds up for that. And I'll demonstrate how I use a bulb auger for reduced tillage planting, which has become increasingly important for us. And hopefully, if we can get it to show and work all right, I'll demonstrate kind of comparative readings from a penetrometer from our different periods of no-till in our market garden here. So yeah, let's keep going. So I worked with Dr. Aaron Silva. As I mentioned, we just wrapped up a project on reduced tillage cucurbits, in 2 systems. So living mulch plasticulture for summer squash. We grew dunja zucchini from Johnny's, and then crimped rye with winter squash. We grew semi-bush acorn, honey bear F1 also from Johnny's. Kind of the main takeaways that I saw from that experience, one being that there's definitely increased potential for competition, whether it's for water or nutrients or whatever it might be. But there's also the potential for yields, and we'll get to that. Other interesting things is I did see some increased pest pressure in the reduced tillage in the crimped rye, but not in the living mulch systems. And we also definitely saw improved water infiltration from some extreme rainfall events, but it didn't necessarily pan out how we'd hoped because there were some impacts with increased unmarketable fruit. So we'll get to that as well. And then one thing I wanted to mention that's really important to me is that for me, working in these reduced tillage systems is just a more pleasant experience for me as a market gardener. And I just wanted to take a moment to mention that because I think it's something that, we don't really think about. It's kind of like yields all the time, go. But here on my family's farm, where my grandparents and my mom still live, and my grandma, who's an artist and has quite the critical aesthetic eye, kind of runs the ship. It's important, and having it look good is important. Having it, not having to slog through mud on rainy harvest days is just like, it's been a game changer for us. So yeah, next slide, I guess. So starting off with the crimped rye system, kind of some overview of the results for the yields. We only saw significant yield drags for marketable fruit per plant in 2018, and for total fruit per plant in 2019. So those are the top 2 graphs that you see there. And you can see that, there was a definite influence from the row mulch that we had combined with the IO mulch. But really in 2018, we saw lower marketable fruit per plant. And in the reduced tillage systems and the rye systems, as well as in the hay systems. And I think that's really because in August, I think it was August 21st or something like that of 2018, at the research station where this took place, we had a single 14-inch rain event in a day about 2 weeks prior to harvest. And so I think just the cultivated treatments letting off more moisture meant that there was, less rot that developed in the fruit. And I think that that's kind of contrary to what we hear sometimes, which is that strip till systems or cover crop, residue mulch-based systems that prevent fruit to soil contact can reduce disease incidence. And so we kind of saw the opposite in that very extreme rain event. That said, those plots didn't wash away. There was, they were underwater for a period of time, the entire plants. We had, mature squash plants literally ripped out of the ground and moved 60 feet and stuff. And, but everything stayed in place in those reduced tillage plots. So there's still the climate benefit, even if we didn't see some of that disease benefit. Similar story with kind of reduced total fruit per plant in the reduced tillage systems in 2019. I think that was due mostly just to, various competition factors. We had a much drier season in 2019. And I think that anecdotally, my experience has been that water is one of the biggest competition factors for reduced tillage systems. And then Important to know is that there was a yield drag, both years, significant yield drag for marketable fruit per area, whether it's, however you want to cut it, per plot, per row fit, whatever it might be. So what that tells me is that, there's the risk for a yield drag, but it's not all said and done. These systems do have the potential to be competitive. Go ahead to the next slide, unless folks have questions. Yeah,
no questions yet, but I just want to let you know that right now you're a headless torso. And I know you're looking at the graphs, but when you can take a step back, then we can see your face. Like another half step back. There's your face again. There you go. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Hard to see the slides when
I hear you.
Yeah. So the other kind of interesting result that we saw in the crimped rye systems, which I think has been consistent with some other research, is that the higher residue treatment saw increased incidence of squash bugs. So they like a place to hide. And so that was most exacerbated when there was plastic mulch, but the hay and rye treatments were also had more incidence of squash bug than the cultivated treatments. That was also true in our study for cucumber beetles, which is contrary to kind of prior research, which shows that basically more diverse systems, more habitat for potential predators. It reduced incidence of cucumber beetles. We didn't see that. And I think that's because we were moving each year. It was, a relatively short period of time that we had that reduced tillage system in place. And so perhaps those longer developing predatorial species, didn't have the chance to establish and the system couldn't really regulate itself. That's not the experience I've had on my farm here. Next slide, I guess. Yeah, and weeds, I guess a big reason people do reduce tillage, especially rye-based or cover crop-based, is for weed suppression. And absolutely 100%, the rye at about 10,000 pounds per acre was almost as weed suppressive as ground hay mulch at 20 tons per acre. So that's amazing, right? I mean, and important to keep in mind there is that is the result of not just the weed suppression after killing the rye and that mulch. It's also the result of competition from the rye, for those biennials through the winter and the early summer annuals and stuff. So you can't just have the biomass, you also need the competition early on. But we definitely saw that it was, very weed suppressive, but it took more time per weed. So when you have a mulch in place and weeds come through, it's more difficult. One caveat here is that we did not have mechanical cultivation. So we were comparing here hand weeding for the hay and rye against using a stirrup hoe in our cultivated plots or cultivated rows as well. So all, very distinct benefit on a weed count perspective, less clear, but still significant, or I should say less large benefit, but still significant when we looked at the amount of weed management time. Go ahead to the next slide. So switching to the living mulch summer squash study that we did. So we're looking at plastic culture systems, thinking about extreme rainfall events that we face here. Those are even more exacerbated, I think, in the plastic culture systems because all that runoff from the beds is concentrated into the aisles. And, we'd seen some nasty erosion. And so looking at, there's been prior research that shows that living mulch in between plastic rows, not only has benefits for, the potential benefits for insect predator populations, for weed suppression, for erosion control, but it also cleans up the water that does infiltrate or run off. So it's, has less phosphorus and nitrogen in it, which is important, obviously. So when we look at yield in the living mulch systems, I was super pleased. The first year we saw that it was very competitive. So no significant differences at all. You can see that's the graph on the left. The graph on the right very few significant differences for the most part of the season, but eventually in terms of the cumulative yield, we saw the hay and the cultivated aisles pull ahead in comparison to our living mulch treatments. For this particular study, the living mulch species that we chose were Dutch white clover and annual ryegrass, and then a mix of the two. So the Dutch white clover was planted at, I believe, 16 pounds per acre, which is definitely on the high side. I'm forgetting the seeding rate for the annual ryegrass, but we went with Albert Lee's recommended rate. And then the mix of the two was about 2/3 of each rate, so not quite a half rate. And it was really interesting to see that the clover had a really high percent coverage. So when you look down, you couldn't really see any soil, versus the ryegrass being, there was a decent amount of bare soil still in there, and the mix was somewhere in between. Go ahead to the next slide. Whoops, this was unmarketable fruit here, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, probably don't need to see the unmarketable fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, you can skip that. Yeah, so for the pests, we saw the opposite of in the crimped rye study. So it definitely seemed like having that associated habitat, something about that was reducing the incidence of both squash bugs and cucumber beetles. Go ahead. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, definite weed suppressive effects, and much higher incidence in 2019 than 2018 overall. What I thought was really interesting that I did not expect, because white clover is kind of a go-to that we hear for people using in living mulch systems, right? And it's always like, oh, it's going to supply nitrogen. It creates a nice mat. It fills in. So if there's damage to the living mulch, to the sod, whether it's from tractor or foot traffic, those stolons creeping along the ground are going to fill that back in. So people really like that too. When it blooms, it's nice pollinator fodder habitat. But what we saw in this study is that it was just not weed suppressive. It was really high incidence, and I was sort of wondering anecdotally, and this was not, we didn't look into this in the study, but if that nitrogen availability could have actually kind of spurred some additional weed growth in those plots, because we didn't see that in the mixed at all in the mixed living aisles. And then go ahead and click forward. I think there's another graph there.
Yep, we're on the second graph of the weeds. Is there another one after this?
Sorry to come forward. I'm just trying to see what we're on.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So this is the cumulative total weed management time. So what we thought was interesting was that, we tried to look at both the time for managing if you're just mowing those living aisles, or if versus the time managing to actually get them clean of weeds, like we are with those cultivated aisles. So this is going to depend on your tolerance for kind of seed set from weeds in your plots. But if you're okay with just mowing and the weeds that are kind of growing perhaps underneath the summer squash canopy that's creeping into the aisles or whatever, if you don't care about those, just the mowing is super quick. That's the next graph. But you can see here that including the hand weeding cleanup time, it was less clear, the benefits. Although again, we had higher weed pressure in 2019. And so that showed in the cultivated treatment. And then click forward one more time. And yeah, so you can see there in that graph, that's just the mower versus hand weeding time. And so if you're okay with just getting the bulk of it through mowing, super clear benefit for weed management time. Again, caveat, no mechanical cultivation. So this is, small scale only. Go ahead. Okay, so switching to my farm, and I'll try to speed it up a little bit. Just some background. We're located here in Crawford County in the Driftless region of Wisconsin. So we have a lot of elevation change. We have a stream just off to my left here. We're at the top of this Rush Creek watershed. And so we get really fast moving water and kind of potential for flash floods quite a bit, but not as much for like cumulative like river floods. But we had, you know, throughout growing up, and then especially once I was kind of had moved back and was starting to farm, you know, we had 100 or 500 year floods in, you know, 1998, 2007, and 2008. We lost like a third of our field, and we almost lost our barn. And it was just really bad. Again, the, you know, first year that I was farming, and in 2016 in this valley that I'm standing in, we literally had a foot of water flowing over the whole thing. There was like fish in the pasture the next day. So potential for flooding, and that's kind of what pushed us to when we started Circadian Organics in 2018. And just to clarify, this was an operating farm when I grew up as well, and Circadian Organics is my and Sky's business. And we decided to go the route of reduced tillage because of those kind of climate impact factors. Down here in the valley, we get really cold, like 10 degrees colder than it'll get on the ridge a lot of times. So I think we're about a zone 4A to 4B. Where, you know, really high humidity, the mist and dew descend early here. Yeah, soil type, it's, you know, nice loose silt loams, beautiful soil. It's relatively high water table, but still kind of well drained. We do irrigate from a well as needed with drip tape and occasional sprinklers depending on the crop. We're about a half acre of mixed veggies down here in the valley. And then we also do some vegetable seed production and some prairie seed production. So we have additional plots on the home farm for that, as well as some 1 to 2 other isolation sites for the vegetable seed per year that are only around 1/10 of an acre each. And those are always living mulch plasticulture systems for reduced maintenance. So go ahead. Yeah, so our living aisle systems, this is applied to pretty much everything except for vining crops. And when we have to do a tillage event, because I've been finding that the living aisles really need to be reset every couple of years, every few years at max. And that's because, you know, our primary weeds that we struggle with here are really, quackgrass. And then we've kind of gotten past the Canadian thistle that we were dealing with. But we just find that, you know, that having that tillage in there every once in a while is good for us to incorporate some additional amendments and to kind of reset the system a little bit. We don't use like large scale tarping like some other folks might. And that's just, I think, a time saving thing for the most part. Go ahead. So the living aisle mix that we use, we buy this pre-mixed DNR trail mix from our local agri center, which is a mix of annual ryegrass, red fescue, perennial ryegrass, and white clover. And I wish I could tell you the ratio, but I am not enough of a nerd to be able to tell the grass seeds apart, so I'm not exactly sure. But we always bump up the white clover a bit, adding like another 6 to 8 pounds per acre ish. So a fairly heavy addition of white clover in there. And then we also will, if we are seeding it in the fall, we'll add rye, cereal rye, which I find kills pretty, you know, decently with repeated mowing, but acts as a better nurse crop in the fall. And we'll occasionally add oats in the spring if I feel like, you know, just the upcoming weather, if it seems like it's going to need more of a nurse crop from potential extreme weather. I want something that'll germinate a little quicker. Go ahead. So some of the primary challenges that I found for dealing with the living aisles is kind of, it does take regular management. So, you have to mow it regularly. And then the water and fertilizer competition factors. And then also low growing weeds. So for us, that's mainly crabgrass that we find after mowing a few times. It'll just set seed lower and lower. So haven't really figured out what to do about that. And it's definitely a pain in the butt when it comes to subsequent direct seeded crops in our kind of tilled rotation for root crops or greens. So yeah, that's definitely a struggle that we have. Go ahead. And yeah, kind of the tips or tricks that we found to managing it successfully is mowing really frequently. I just use a push mower with a rear discharge that can also be a mulching mower when necessary. When we have let the cover crop get too tall and we have to go through with a beefier weeder or a beefier mower, or open up the side discharge or open up the rear discharge all the way, I feel like I've really seen increased disease incidence from that, the offcut blowing into the cash crop, especially in tomatoes a couple times where that happened and the grass just mats against it. And then you add the humidity on top of that, and it's just a recipe for disease. So we also all rogue problem weeds. So like stuff that we miss, that's kind of underneath the canopy of stuff flopping into the aisles. I will not. I don't care if the ryegrass or the clover is setting seed, because I just feel like we've got bigger fish to fry as far as the weed control goes. And we do, as I mentioned, we kind of reset every few years, and that's primarily because of that quack grass. But I feel like also the white clover gets a little bit too established after a few years. As far as controlling the edges of the bed goes, we use plastic. And so that kind of controls the edge when that's in the rotation. And then we have also had success with controlling it when we are undercutting garlic or root crop. And it does kind of ball up on the edge of the undercutter, the white clover and red fescue. But it's not so bad. You just occasionally scrape it off if necessary. And that's really nice for getting a clean, bed width back again. I forgot to mention that our primary setup is 18-inch paths and 4-foot beds. So those are fairly big path to bed ratio, I feel like. But we just like the maneuverability in there. It does make for more mowing. And then a lot of times at our isolation sites, depending on what mower is best to get out there, we'll either do 18 inches as in the path, or sometimes 4 foot if it's a 4-foot riding mower that we have at a buddy's farm. Yeah, and then it's really important not to undershoot the irrigation or the fertilizer, because it's just really competitive. And I found, honestly, I feel like especially for water, that clover can just be really competitive for water. Go ahead.
Hey, Dylan, one question for you quick. There's a comment that mowing higher helps reduce crabgrass. Where do you set your mower on your push mower, or is it different on the riding mower you bring in? And then did you say 18-inch paths and 4-foot beds?
Yeah, I did say that for our bed and path width. And we set the mower deck about 4 inches high. And so that's really interesting. I never thought of I always thought going lower would be a better kill. And so that's really cool. I'll have to look into that. That's a good tip. And yeah, adjustable height. So one of the things we do with the living mulch as well is for the vining crops, I'll let it go. We let it go, up until they're getting ready to vine out. And then I'm kind of almost scalp it, get the mower really low, and occasionally actually scalp the surface. And then we'll put either landscape fabric or a thick mat of mulch out there on top of it right before they vine out. For kind of a spring cover crop based reduced tillage approach, I've had really good success with just an oat pea mix that I just plant as early as I possibly can roll down late May or early June, and then put plastic on top of it. So you can see I literally just took our burn barrel and or what will be a burn barrel and rolled it out over it to knock it down, pinned it down with black plastic on top of it, waited. I've planted 2 days later, planted a week later, planted 2 weeks later. For sure, if you can afford the 2 weeks, it's just incredible tilth and biological activity in there. About a weekend or 5 days to a week, it's kind of like a scary level of biological activity. Like I'm putting it in, I'm like, okay, is this going to give my veggies some crazy mold? Because there's just like, insane fungal growth underneath there, underneath the plastic going on. And I feel like I have seen increased incidence of damping off and when I do plant too early into that. Well, I say damping off. I don't know if it's pythium or some other rot, but yeah, it does get it sometimes. And then when I plant right away, it is like a couple days after or something, it will be pushing up on the plastic, but or the landscape fabric, whatever we're using. And honestly, we will just stick an extra landscape fabric pin or an occasional clod of dirt or rock like every few plants or something, because there is a risk, depending on the transplant size, that it'll get stuck underneath there and just cook under there. But I wish it was earlier in the season so I could show you this biological activity, because it is just incredible, looking under that plastic at this. So the other caveat that I would say is that I did actually, I think last year when this picture was taken in that tunnel where we put peppers, particularly the hot peppers, I think got nitrogen shock. So I'd never heard of somebody growing too much nitrogen with a cover crop, but that's for sure what it was. Just the dimpled leaves and blossom drop and excess vegetative growth. We had, our peppers were like this tall and had, especially the poblanos had reduced fruit set. And so just look out for that, because you can grow a lot of nitrogen with cover crop. I've heard Sandy Seiberg from Purple Cow talk about growing roughly 120 pounds per acre of nitrogen with peas in the spring. So you can get a lot of nitrogen out of that, and that's what we've started to do for our peppers and for our cucurbits. That's the only nitrogen that they get. Go ahead. Yeah, and then rolled rye. So, for sure, experiences out of this that I would want to share is like, you have to get it in early. So for me, that's like mid-September, late September at the absolute latest, but it has to have really good growing conditions. Plant it thick, so 3 to 4 bushels per acre. And planting even thicker is not going to make up for a late seeding date. And if you have a thin stand, so like 2019, we were a little bit on the thin. Was it 2019? I don't remember. One year we were a little on the thin side because it was like, planting and fall growth went great. And then it was just like cold and dry in the spring. And so, you got to have a good stand. So I think that picture at the top left that you're seeing, I believe was taken at the beginning of April. That was a beautiful stand and beautiful no-till conditions we got out of there. I crimp at anthesis versus down south. They can wait until the kind of soft dough stage. But we crimp at anthesis, which is first or second week of June, usually around the 7th or 13th-ish in there. And this, the crimper that you saw highlighted in last week's session worked amazing. It worked just as well to kill rye, if not better, compared to a 15-foot Rodale style chevron blade crimper. So no joke, that's a great tool, and I hope it's released and manufactured more broadly pretty soon. I've also used a sickle bar mow, but then we have to a lot of times we'll have to kind of rake and maneuver that, because the smaller scale sickle bar mowers still kind of toss stuff off to this one side or the other a lot of times. And that's a pain to have to kind of clean up that seed bed. And then the other thing I'd say is select cultivars that are naturally more weed suppressive or going to form a better canopy. And so particularly, I've had really good success with cucurbits and pretty good success with brassicas in this crimped rye, and great success with hemp in the crimped rye systems. And for the winter squash, I really try and select varieties that have aggressive vines, aggressive adventitious rooting, and can compete well, because late season there's kind of the potential for a fall off in the weed control after the rye has started to break down. So you can see there, I select, one example is this big blossom Grex. It's a Maxima bred by Wild Mountain Seed out of Colorado. Great short season, aggressive grower, huge, beautiful fruit. Blossoms the size of my hand, great for chefs. And that one was just super vigorous. And so you can see it, just a couple weeks after plant direct seeding, was coming along nicely. And we've gotten great harvests off of that. And anecdotally, I actually feel like there's a couple varieties that have done better for me in the crimped rye here at my farm, as compared to in kind of a conventional tilled plastic and hay system at UW-Madison that I've grown. Go ahead. I think that's about it. So I just threw up kind of the 2 tunnel rotations that we used. So on the left, I was absolutely loving that rotation, but it was really reliant on the hemp. I wanted to highlight the hemp because a crop like that, or the winter squash, that you can stay out of for a long period of time is really going to help. Because I think one of the other things that I've kind of struggled with in the reduced tillage system is compaction in high traffic areas. So particularly for the tomato crops, or some of the other crops, it's like I really see a big compaction effect over time, and I'm not coming back in and breaking it up, or when I do, it's with a broad fork, and it takes a lot of energy and effort. So we got amazing tilth, and I'm going to try and show you that in this tunnel that had hemp in it last year. But there's no market for hemp anymore, for the CBD hemp. So we cut that out. And so on the right is kind of what we're moving to for this year and in the future, until we can produce some type of cannabis again. We'll add it back into the rotation. Go ahead. And yeah, that's kind of a sample field rotation that we use for the living aisle. So tilling and doing some greens or root crops, living aisles with alliums. So I'll till in the fall that first time for the greens or root crops, anything direct seeded that we need a nice, really good soil tilth, and then till again for the alliums, and establish the living aisles that year, and then use the living aisles for brassicas, or use the living aisles with the oat pea mix in the beds for cucurbits or something else. Go ahead. That might be it.
I think that's your last slide.
Awesome. All right. So I had a couple things that I wanted to share here. Any other questions before I move around the field?
I think people are ready to see what you got out there. We're ready to see your weeds.
Okay, cool. You can see them. They're here. So I wanted to show the example of this penetrometer. So I'm going to bring this a little bit out into the field. And we just had a nice big rainstorm before this, so I'm not sure how well it's going to work or if it'll just slip right into the soil. But so this is, where I'm standing right now has been path for the past few years. And so I'm expecting a lot more compaction, as opposed to what is on my right here, which is a safflower crop for Seed Savers Exchange, that was last tilled in fall of 2019 to establish rye. No-till hemp in it last year, and then we no-tilled the safflower plugs into that this year. You can see, or maybe you can see, I'm not sure, but we've got quite a bit of hairy Galanzoga in here. So great weed suppression last year. And despite that, and despite also tarping on top of it this spring before planting this crop, we still got significant weeds coming through, and these didn't form a great canopy in terms of weed suppression. So that's kind of one lesson learned, you know, is I mean, this is a new crop for us, but if I'm going to plant something else that isn't as competitive in terms of the canopy for an additional year and rely on no-till, I'll probably put down landscape fabric or some additional hay mulch or something. But the safflower likes generally drier conditions, so I didn't want to go that route. So let me do this penetrometer. You saw a demo of one type of penetrometer last week that was kind of a simpler type with just a gauge on the top that showed you the pressure. It didn't have an associated depth that it shows. This is a little bit of a fancier one, courtesy of Dr. Silva's lab at UW-Madison. And this is really interesting if you can get an extension agent out there to look at your compaction layers, and especially look at them before you establish a no-till system, because you might want to get a deep ripper or a chisel plow in there to break stuff up before you try and go that route. So here in the path, all right, we're at 140 down to 2 inches, 150, and then 4 inches. After 4 inches, it's just sinking in. So not too much potential for compaction that I just saw there. Let me get this into the bed here. And again, it could be because we got that another big rainfall. So in the bed where there hasn't been traffic, and we never topped 120 here, so little bit less. And then I wanted to contrast this to the tunnel right behind me where we had hemp. Because another thing that I've noticed is just keeping the soil covered over the winter seems to really help the compaction as well, just from early rainfall as well as maybe the soil melt. Let's see, I'm gonna go all the way down here. So what you see me walking past right now was our alliums this year. We ended up changing our aisle width this year. And so we tilled and we used corn stover as mulch, which was an experiment. It's what we could get affordably versus high quality straw. And, you know, it had great weed suppression initially. And then as stuff started to deteriorate, it didn't really hold up. However, I did not see any like major impacts, which was really exciting because we were a little bit worried about that. We had a little bit of discussion on our cover crop reduced tillage vegetable production listserv, which you should join. And if Rue or other folks are from the project are on the call, maybe they can drop the link to join that email listserv. There sometimes we get some good conversations going on there. Sometimes you might just see me emailing out with random nerdy cover crop updates. Before I duck into the tunnel here, behind me is our most of our winter squash, and this is in plastic with again the kind of system that I was mentioning where we had the reposition a little here. We had the living aisles at the beginning of the season, which did really well, and kept those mowed. And then we experimented with both putting down landscape fabric. I'm gonna pop this off the stand actually, and
Yeah, go ahead. Show us the ground there.
Yeah. So on my left here is where we put landscape fabric over the aisle. And on my right, we put we just put corn stover, and there's not a lot of difference in terms of weed incidence. It's a very clean field. This is some lemongrass, not a weed, so a little bit deceiving, but let's peek in here. So and this
Dylan, we're losing your audio a little bit. Whoop. Dylan, are you there? Dylan, you're muted.
Hey, can you hear me now? Sorry,
Yep, you're back. No, you're all right.
looks like I dove into the soil too much and I lost connection.
You went underground and we lost you.
Did you get to see the soil at all there?
We could see under the leaves a little bit, but I wouldn't say we could see the soil very well.
Okay, at risk of disconnecting, I want to try one more time because I think
Okay.
it's just amazing to show how that like very established sod, really no different of fescue and perennial ryegrass in there. And rogue dog has turned into just a beautiful bare soil. Can you see that at all?
We can see it. It's a little bit blurry, but it does look, actually, I can now see some of the structure in the tilth that you're showing us there. And it looks nice. Looks nice.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry for not having a better connection or quality, I guess. But point being that with some cover on there, especially something that's going to provide a little extra heat, and it's just amazing the worm activity that's gets going on. And then to show you the stover version. Can you see anything there?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty nice shot there. We can see that the corn stover is still present. Yeah.
And the soil underneath it is quite bare. So between the canopy of the squash and the stover, it really did effectively kill that living mulch. Okay, that was a little digression, and now I'll duck into the tunnel here.
And I think if you keep it on the horizontal, the landscape, there you go. Yep.
Okay, sorry for the, I thought I was going to have a camera person tonight, but ended up being just me.
That's all right.
Turns out some people want to do things off farm sometimes, which I don't know. Seems a little weird, but
It's like it's
okay. Here
like
we go.
it's 2021 or something. It's not 2020 anymore. People
Yeah,
found
what?
places to go. I don't know.
Okay, so try and get a decent shot in here. All right, can you see the tunnel kind of?
Yeah. Yeah, yep, go ahead.
So this is kind of our earlier pepper and tomato planting that followed the hemp. And so I'm going to show a reading now from the path in here. So I think that, again, that hemp was just so amazing because we were, hardly in here for most of the season. And even the walking paths in here just still had beautiful soil structure when we came in. Okay, I can't seem to get this thing to work. So we'll skip that. Try and show you by hand here. So what we did in here this year is, like I said, no-till hemp on rye last year. You can, whoops, I'm just looking at me. You can still see some of the rye residue here, which, it's amazing for how long that holds up. Here, and put down a light rate of fertilizer over top of the whole thing. So we just broadcast a kind of crop specific mix, but only at 80 pounds of N per acre versus, might go higher for the tomatoes otherwise, or not even 80, it was more like 40. And just put that right over the surface, stapled landscape fabric on top, drilled holes, which I might get to demonstrate that auger tool if we have time, and put some compost into the planting holes. And you can see that, nothing is looking hungry in here. And, we've done very little disease or pest control or foliar feeding or anything of that nature. But we really struggle with leaf mold down here in the valley. But otherwise, the crops are looking very healthy. So let's see if I can get down at the soil somewhere. So I don't know if you can see the structure in there at all, but it's been this beautiful picture, and that auger just flew into the soil down to a depth of 10 plus inches, which was awesome for setting our tomatoes really nice and deep for this early planting.
And we weren't able to see the ground very well, but I think that seeing the auger tool would be cool for folks. It's giving us a little bit of low bandwidth in the tunnel here, so.
Okay, I'll hop out of the tunnel and go grab that auger tool. Before I do, this is our later planting of tomatoes and peppers, which we was cucurbits the year before, and we basically just broadcast oats and peas ahead of a lot of rain, let that grow up, and that was all of the fertilizer for these, except for a little bit of compost into the planting hole, and they're doing beautifully as well. All right, and sorry for the marching back and forth here, but I'm gonna go grab.
Right. That's what we came to see.
Any questions crop up yet so far?
No, I think people are just kind of watching. One question I had was, you said you often plant, rye early September, mid-September. Do you ever irrigate it, or do you just kind of rely on getting at least a couple good rains in with that early seeding?
We have irrigated it on small plots in acts of desperation, but really we've just relied on getting good rain after the seeding. The other thing I would say is, like, if the soil is really hungry and you had a high like a heavy feeding crop ahead of it, don't skimp on the fertility for the rye, because that biomass is like, you only got that shot, and if it doesn't produce enough biomass, it can just be a disaster. So for this auger tool, this is just a bulb auger. This is like a medium duty one that I found on Amazon for like $16. And, with a 20-volt DeWalt drill, with a relatively light battery, probably 2 amp-hour battery or something. And I would say that, having a powerful drill is really helpful for this, but you have to be really cautious not to overdo it and push your drill too hard, because you can definitely burn out the clutch on them. If the drill is getting really hot, and I've found that the planting itself is with a crew is a little bit less efficient, because we are what I end up doing is wanting to let the drill rest for a little bit. The other thing that can be nice is just if you have a couple different drills at hand that you can switch the auger in between, because just constantly running it can be very difficult. Ooh, now this is when I want my tripod again, but
Yeah.
let's just try without it. So kind of tricks that I've found for this are to let it kind of do the work and not push it too hard. It needs a little bit of down pressure, but you really have to just rely on it biting into it and not pushing down too hard. There's kind of two options here. You can either just let it spin and kind of throw dirt out of the hole, or really kind of push it in and get in there. This definitely does have the risk of creating kind of a smear effect along the sides of the hole that it's digging out, and creating some compaction there. And we've definitely see that, especially like when we've used this up on our ridge land that's more heavy clay, and if we are going in a little bit too wet. But it's worked in that heavy clay as well. And so what I like to do is let it bite in a little ways, kind of pull it back out, loosen that soil, hopefully fracture it out a little bit to the side of the actual action of the auger bit, and then dig back in. So I'll demonstrate that now. Maybe I'll mute myself so you don't have to listen to the drill. So you can see how the creeping Charlie and the quackgrass absolutely love our reduced tillage. The worst thing you can do is just like tilling once or something and then letting it go. But I've got a really nice planting hole here right now. And, one of the benefits that I think Claire and Rue were mentioning last week is I can do that basically from a standing position. It's fairly fairly quick, and come in and throw in some compost in there and plant something pretty deep. This is definitely hitting some compaction, like 6 inches down or so, or 5 inches down. But this has also kind of become de facto path here because we didn't have a plant. So that could be the factor as well.
Hey, Dylan, I got a question here for you. First, that's a brushless drill to reduce overheating compared to a brushed drill. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. And then how many holes can you drill sort of in a row without needing to rest and let it cool down?
So with my like 18-volt Makita drill that is a little bit beat up, I like 5 before and what I'll usually do is like drill 5, fill the compost and plant so it has a little rest, and then go back and do it if I'm just planting. And this one, this 20-volt DeWalt can do a good 15, or, and by row I mean 100 bed feet or row feet, and definitely a good 15 to 20 in a row before it really starts to heat up.
Great. And we are getting, Dylan, about to 7 o'clock. Was there anything else you wanted to make sure you covered before we start to wrap it up for the evening?
I was going to try and show you the residue decomposition under here, but see if I can get to it. So you can see, yeah, you can see there's definitely still residue from the oats and peas there. It's covering the soil, even in the path, which I'm especially happy about, but it's not a lot. And the actual tilth of the soil in here, once again, is just beautiful. It's,
Yeah, we can see a little bit of that, but oh, there's a good shot of it. There's a good shot of it, yeah.
Buttery and rich.
Oh, that's great. Someday we will have the video technology and rural bandwidth to see all of this crystal clear, and I bet it'll be here in only a couple short years, and we will forget that we ever had occasionally fuzzy streaming.
Well, I hope it worked all right, and yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and don't hesitate to be in touch. Maybe someone can throw my email in the chat there, but happy to answer any questions that people have. If you want to stop by and visit, you're always welcome. And yeah.
Awesome. Hang on, I'm just going to share a couple more slides before we get out of things here. But Dylan, yeah, thank you so much for taking the time this evening. I know it's a busy time of year for you, to show us kind of what's going on the farm right now and take us through the rotations and stuff that you're doing. Again, everyone, you can revisit this. Those slides were really awesome, so definitely revisit those as you want. And we'll have that recording up really soon, probably in the next couple days. Next week, we're going to be back in Iowa looking at some really mulch-based systems for no-till at a farm in Iowa City. So I hope to see a lot of you there. And I just want to give another thank you to Dylan at Circadian Organics, our partners at the University of Wisconsin Extension, and the rest of the farms that we'll be seeing upcoming in this series. So with that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.